The great halls of the Varek Dominion had not heard music in 3 years. Once those halls had rung with the sound of war drums and celebration, with the voices of commanders returning victorious from campaigns across 6 star systems. The banners of the Varek bloodline still hung from the vaulted ceilings, deep violet and gold, stitched with the sigil of the twin moons. But they had grown still, heavy, like mourning cloth draped over something the Empire refused to bury. Empress Solvara sat upon the obsidian throne the way stone sits at the bottom of a river, unmoving, cold, worn down slowly by something invisible. Her people called her the Iron Mother, but those who served closest to her knew the iron had cracked long ago. It had cracked the morning the War Council placed a single broken pauldron on the floor before her, all that remained of her daughter's destroyed flagship, and told her the Crown Princess Avon was gone. Avon had been everything the Empire was not yet ready to lose. She was 24 cycles old when she took command of the Dominion's forward fleet. She had her mother's eyes, sharp and dark as deep space, but her father's recklessness, the kind that looked like courage until it saved your life 3 times in a row and you realized it had been courage all along. She laughed loudly in council chambers. She argued with generals twice her age and was usually right. She carried the future of the Varek line in the way she walked, like she had already decided the universe would cooperate. And then the Battle of Keth Hollow happened. The enemy, a coalition of territorial expansionists called the Shirasi Compact, had laid a trap inside a dead nebula. Avon's fleet flew into it. The signals went dark within minutes. When the Dominion's rescue ships arrived 3 days later, they found only wreckage and silence and the cold mathematics of loss. The Empire mourned for 7 days. Then it expected its empress to rise and move forward. Solvara rose, she moved forward, but something in her had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere no one could follow. She still sat in council. She still reviewed defense reports and signed orders. She still wore the crown during ceremonies. But her eyes, those sharp, dark eyes, had turned inward. She was present in the room and absent from the world at the same time. Her advisors spoke around her carefully, the way people speak near something that might shatter. And the Dominion suffered for it. At the outer borders, the Shirasi Compact pressed closer. Their patrol ships tested Varek sensor ranges. Their diplomats sent messages that were barely polite. Merchant convoys near the third ring of controlled space began to thin as merchant convoys chose safer paths. Within the council chamber, generals argued with each other because arguing with the Empress had become something no one dared do. Some called for stronger military spending. Others pushed for a treaty, whispering the word surrender behind their hands where no one could officially hear them. The Empire was bleeding from a wound it could not see. Every night, Empress Solvara walked the crystalline garden behind the palace. It was Avon's favorite place. She had grown up running between the bioluminescent trees that glowed pale blue in the dark, chasing the small 6-winged creatures that nested in the high branches. The garden still glowed the same. The creatures still nested, but the laughter was gone, and the silence that replaced it was the loudest thing Solvara had ever heard. She never cried in front of her people. She had decided that much. A mother could grieve, an empress could not afford to grieve. So she held the grief inside like a stone held underwater, pressing it down, keeping it from the surface, feeling its weight in every breath. until, one night, standing beneath the pale glow of the crystal trees, she stopped pressing. She whispered her daughter's name into the dark, just once, just to feel it in her mouth again, to remember what it felt like when that name meant someone who was alive. The wind moved through the crystal branches and said nothing back. Solvara closed her eyes. She was not a woman who believed in signs or fate or the kindness of the universe. She was an empress. She believed in fleets and strategy and the cold logic of survival. But in that garden, in that silence, something in her refused to fully surrender the idea that Avon was gone. A mother feels what instruments cannot measure. She had no evidence, she had no signal, she had only a hollow place in her chest that had not yet gone completely dark. She did not know it then, but she was right. Far beyond the outer patrol lines, beyond the mapped edges of Varek space, in a region of dead stars and broken moons where no Dominion ship had traveled in decades, something had begun to pulse.
A signal, faint as a heartbeat heard through stone. It carried a code that only 3 people in the galaxy knew. A royal emergency cipher embedded deep inside a stream of static, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. A cipher that belonged to Crown Princess Avon. The outpost technicians who caught it stared at their screens for a long time before they reported it. They ran 3 separate confirmation checks. Their supervisors told their fleet. Fleet Command brought it to the palace with shaking hands and very careful words, saying it might be a ghost signal, a malfunction, an enemy trick. But when Empress Solvara looked at the data herself, looked at the precise pattern buried inside the noise, her hands went still on the console. She said nothing for a long time. Then, very quietly, she said, "Find where it came from." That night, for the first time in 3 years, she did not walk the garden with grief. She walked it with something more dangerous: hope. And in the heart of a crumbling empire, hope can be more powerful than any fleet or more destructive than any weapon, depending entirely on what comes next. The capital world of Varek Prime had not gathered like this since the old coronation. They came to the spaceport and to the observation platforms and to the open plazas where the broadcast screens flickered with live feed from the royal docking bay. They came because the word had spread the way impossible things always spread, first as rumor, then as whisper, then as something no one could stop saying aloud. The princess's cipher, a ship coming home. Empress Solvara stood at the edge of the royal landing platform in formal state robes that she had not worn since Avon's departure 3 years ago. Her guard flanked her in full ceremonial armor, their weapons visible, their faces unreadable. Behind her, the council waited in tight, anxious clusters. The generals had argued all morning about whether the ship should be boarded and searched before it landed. They had argued about trap probabilities and enemy deception strategies. Solvara had listened to all of it. Then she had said, "Let it land." The ship came through the upper atmosphere trailing fire. Not engine fire, not the controlled burn of a standard descent, but actual damage fire, the kind that meant the hull had been through things that should have killed everyone inside. It was a mid-class Varek military cruiser, or it had been once. Now it was something that survived by refusing to stop. Plating was missing along the starboard side. One engine cowling had been replaced with what looked like salvaged material from a completely different class of vessel. The hull bore scorch marks that had been burned into the metal at temperatures that suggested weapons fire, orbital re-entry, or both at some point on the same day. The crowd watching the broadcast fell quiet as it descended. It touched down on the royal platform with a sound like a deep exhale, metal settling, pressure releasing, as if the ship itself had been holding its breath across the entire journey. The landing ramp extended slowly. Steam rose from the vents. Something crackled in the damaged electrical systems. And then, through the drifting haze, a figure appeared. She was thinner than Solvara remembered. Her formal armor was gone, replaced by a flight suit that had been repaired so many times, in so many places, it was barely the original material anymore. There were scars along her jaw and her left hand, and she walked with a slight heaviness in her right leg that spoke of an injury healed without proper medical equipment. Her dark hair was cut shorter than she had ever worn it, but her eyes were the same. Solvara felt something split open in the center of her chest. 3 years of pressed-down grief and desperate, irrational hope colliding at once into something so large she could not name it. She held herself still by sheer discipline, by the understanding that thousands of people were watching and that she was her empress before she was anything else. But her hands, hidden in the folds of her robes, shook. Avon walked down the ramp slowly, not from weakness, but from intention, the way someone walks when they need every moment of an arrival to feel real. When she reached the bottom and her boots touched the platform of her home world, she stopped. She looked at her mother, and then she placed her right fist against her chest in the oldest Varek salute, the one given only to the reigning sovereign. "I have returned, Empress," she said. Her voice was steady, her eyes were not. Solvara took a step forward, then another. Protocol dissolved somewhere behind her. The crowd, the generals, the cameras, all of it fell back, and there was only the distance between her and her daughter, which she crossed without ceremony. She put her hand against Avon's face. She felt warmth, living warmth, the irreducible proof that her daughter was real and breathing and here.
She said nothing. She could not have said anything useful. Avon covered her mother's hand with her own. "I know," she said softly. "I know." For 3 seconds they simply stood like that, empress and princess, mother and daughter, grief and relief meeting in the space between 2 hands. Then Solvara stepped back, straightened, became the empress again. She looked past Avon to the top of the ramp. A figure stood there, having waited with a patience that suggested he had learned when to give people space and when to fill it. He was not Varek. He was not any species that belonged to the Dominion or any of its neighboring territories. He was human, a species the Empire had encountered only in the abstract, in trade records and diplomatic footnotes and the occasional detained vessel. Humans were considered a minor species, physically unremarkable, shorter-lived than most, without the biological advantages that gave the Varek their strength or the Shirasi their sensory range. He was tall by human standards, lean, and he moved down the ramp with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had learned to treat every room as a potential threat. His uniform was military in origin, but had been stripped of any obvious insignia, and it bore the same evidence of long survival that Avon's flight suit did. His eyes swept the platform, catalogued the guards, measured the distances, and then settled on the Empress with an expression that was not fear, and was not challenge. It was simply attention, clear, direct, and steady. He did not bow. He did not step back. He came to stand beside Avon with the ease of someone who had done so 10,000 times before, and he remained there quietly while the court absorbed the impossibility of his presence. The murmur that moved through the assembled nobles and generals was not quite speech. It was the sound of a collective assumption breaking. Avon turned her head slightly toward him, then looked back at her mother. "He is the reason I am standing here," she said, simple, without performance. Solvara studied the human for a long moment. She was an empress who had survived 4 decades of politics and 3 major wars. She knew how to read people, alien or otherwise, across the full range of what people could be. She looked at this man, and she saw the same thing she had seen in her best commanders, the ones who lasted. Not fearlessness, which was just a failure of imagination, but something more useful. The capacity to be afraid and move forward anyway, so many times that it had become simply the way you moved. "What is your name?" she asked him. Rael Donner. His accent was human standard, clipped and precise. "Lieutenant, Earth Exploration Corps. Formerly." "Formerly," she repeated. "My ship was destroyed 8 months before I found the princess. I've been surviving in Shirasi-controlled wreckage fields for most of the time since. Rank stopped mattering a while ago." Solvara looked at her daughter. "And what is he to you?" Avon answered without hesitation. "The person who decided I was worth saving when there was no tactical reason to do so. The person who kept me alive when I had given up on it. My equal in every way that counts." The silence that followed those words was the loudest thing the royal platform had ever held. The generals behind Solvara exchanged looks. The nobles did not know where to point their outrage first. A human, standing at the princess's side, being called her equal in front of the entire court and the broadcasting eyes of Varek Prime. Solvara turned and walked back toward the palace doors, and her voice carried behind her like the snap of a flag in wind. "Bring them both inside. We have much to discuss." She did not look back, but inside the armor of her composure, something had shifted that would not shift back. Her daughter was alive. Her daughter had been kept alive by a human, a member of a species her empire had never once considered fearing. She was beginning to think that had been a very expensive mistake.
The War Council chamber of Varek Prime had survived 4 different architectural styles across 3 centuries of rebuilding. Its current walls were dark stone, threaded with veins of glowing mineral that pulsed faintly in the dark, a reminder that the planet itself was alive beneath the palace. It was a room built to hold difficult truths. That evening, it held one of the most difficult in the Dominion's recorded history. Avon stood at the center of the chamber and spoke for 40 minutes without stopping. She spoke about Keth Hollow, about the trap that had been laid with intelligence that could only have come from someone inside the Dominion's own command structure, about the moment her flagship was struck and the bridge went dark and she found herself alone in an escape pod drifting through the debris field of her own fleet, about the 3 days she spent in that pod before the air recycler began to fail, and about the moment she heard something moving through the wreckage outside and thought it was Shirasi salvagers coming to take prisoners. It had not been Shirasi salvagers. Rael Donner had been living in the wreckage fields of Keth Hollow for nearly 9 months at that point. His own ship, an Earth Core survey vessel that had strayed into the conflict zone during the initial battle, had been destroyed in the same engagement that took down Avon's fleet. He had been the only survivor. He had spent those 9 months doing what he had been trained to do in survival scenarios, and then going considerably further than his training had ever anticipated. He had mapped the wreckage fields. He had identified which destroyed ships still had functioning life support pockets. He had built a route through the debris that avoided Shirasi patrol patterns. He had established small caches of food, water, and medical supplies harvested from the ruins. He had, in essence, turned a graveyard into a habitat, because the alternative was dying, and he had apparently decided against that. When he found Avon's escape pod, he cracked it open and looked at the injured, half-conscious Varek princess inside and made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. He brought her into his network. He kept her alive. "We spent 6 months in those wreckage fields," Avon told the council. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were not. The Shirasi were actively searching for survivors. They knew the princess of the Varek Dominion might have escaped. They had ships running patrol grids through the debris every 72 hours. We could not run. We could not signal for help without bringing them directly to us. A general interrupted. "Then how did you survive?" Avon glanced at Rael, who stood to her left. "We did not hide the way the Shirasi expected us to hide. We moved constantly. We used the debris patterns that their sensor sweeps couldn't penetrate cleanly. We built decoys from salvage to suggest occupation in sectors we were no longer in. We misdirected. We confused. We used their own patrol schedules against them." "We," the general said with an inflection that made the word sound like skepticism. "He designed the system, I learned it, and then I helped him improve it." Rael spoke for the first time. The wreckage field was enormous. One person cannot monitor it all, but 2 people can split the observation. The princess learned faster than anyone I've ever worked with. Within a month, she was identifying patrol pattern variations I had missed. A noble near the far wall made a sound of disbelief. "You are describing a royal heir doing field surveillance in a debris field." "I am describing the reason she is alive." Silence. Empress Solvara had not spoken. She sat at the head of the council table with her hands folded and her eyes moving between her daughter and the human. She was cataloging, processing, the way she always processed information before making a decision that would last. Avon continued. She spoke about the 6 months after the wreckage fields, the months of cross-country travel through 3 different Shirasi-occupied territories, living in ruins, moving at night, surviving on what they could find. She spoke about the moment she had been badly wounded during a Shirasi sweep, and Rael had carried her for 2 days across open terrain to reach a dead city where they could shelter. She spoke about the moment she had found him unconscious from blood loss and had kept watch over him for 36 hours straight, drawing on every survival principle he had taught her.
"He taught me that humans do not measure strength the way we do," she said. "We measure strength in biology, in what the body can do, in how long a species has existed and what it has conquered. Humans measure strength differently. They measure it in refusal, in the decision to continue when continuation seems impossible. It is not a biological fact for them. It is a choice they make, over and over, until making it becomes who they are." The chamber was very quiet. One of the older generals, a decorated commander named Voskran, who had served through 2 major wars and was not known for sentiment, leaned forward. "You are saying that a human kept you alive through sheer stubbornness?" I am saying, Alyevin replied, that a human kept me alive because he refused to conceive of a world in which he did not, and that is something I have never seen in any soldier of the Dominion, including myself. Voskran sat back. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did. Solvara finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, and it carried to every corner of the room. And the signal we received, the royal cipher? Rael built the transmitter from salvage components, from memory, without access to any technical documentation. It took him 4 months. He had never worked with Varek military communications equipment before. He learned the principles from examining destroyed components and rebuilt the logic from first principles. Every eye in the room turned to Rael. He said nothing. He did not perform modesty. He simply looked back at the empress and waited. Solvara studied him for a long moment. Then she said something that no one in that room had expected her to say. "Tell me how you think." The generals shifted. The nobles exchanged glances. It was an extraordinary request, unprecedented in council proceedings. Rael considered it. "I find the shape of the problem before I look for solutions," he said. "Most problems look like walls. If you approach them as walls, you will spend your time trying to break through or go around. But every wall has a weight distribution, a structural logic. If you understand why the wall is standing, you often find that the solution isn't to move the wall at all." Silence stretched across the chamber like ice forming on still water. Solvara said, "We have a war coming." Rael said, "I know. I've been watching the Shirasi fleet movements since we re-entered Dominion space." Another silence, longer. "And," Solvara said, "they're going to hit you in 3 places simultaneously and expect you to spread your defense. That's the wall they want you to try to break. The real problem isn't where they're attacking, it's what they're protecting when they do." General Voskran stood up from his seat, not in anger, in attention. He said, "Show me." And for the first time in the history of the Varek Dominion, a human being moved to the command table and placed his hands on the star map. No one stopped him, not even the generals who had spent the last 2 hours resenting his presence. Because when Rael Donner began to speak, the map began to make sense in ways it hadn't before. That night, Empress Solvara walked alone to the crystalline garden. She stood where she had stood 3 years ago, whispering her daughter's name into the dark. She stood there now and felt the full weight of what had happened, what was still happening. Her daughter had returned, but not unchanged, harder, sharper, bonded by fire to a human who had proven in a single evening that the Empire had spent generations looking at his species and seeing only what it expected to see. She looked up at the stars and thought about all the things she had believed that were no longer true. Then she went back inside. There was a war to plan, and for the first time, the Varek Dominion would not be planning it alone.
The Shirasi Compact launched its assault on the 53rd day after Avon's return. They came in 3 columns, exactly as Rael had predicted. The first struck at the Dominion's fuel processing stations near the outer ring, a logistical blow designed to strand the defense fleets. The second pushed at the communication relay network, targeting the nodes that coordinated fleet movement across the entire system. The third, the true hammer, drove straight toward Varek Prime itself. The Dominion's War Council had watched this unfolding on the star map for 6 days as the Shirasi forces moved into position, and they had used every one of those 6 days to prepare something the Shirasi command had no framework to anticipate. The fuel stations they hit were empty. The Dominion had shifted its reserves 2 weeks prior, quietly, ship by ship, to secondary caches in locations so obscure they barely appeared on updated charts. The Shirasi found themselves burning through their own ammunition to destroy infrastructure that held nothing. The communication relays they targeted were broadcasting on schedule when the attack hit. They continued broadcasting for 11 minutes afterward. Then they went dark, because they had already been dark for 4 days. The signals had been pre-recorded and set to transmit on a loop by a network of decoy emitters positioned exactly where the Shirasi expected the real nodes to be. And the hammer column driving toward Varek Prime met not a panicked, scrambling defense, but empty space. The Dominion's main fleet was not where it was supposed to be. It was behind the Shirasi hammer column. The maneuver had taken 3 weeks of quiet repositioning, moving ships in patterns that individually looked like routine patrol shifts, but collectively constituted the most complex fleet movement the Dominion's navigators had ever attempted. Rail had mapped the approach on the first night. Avon had translated it into commands her commanders could execute. General Voskran had run the logistics with a precision that surprised everyone, including himself, because for the first time in his career he was working from a plan that made sense to him at a level beneath strategy, at the level of pure, clear logic. When the Shirasi hammer column realized what was behind them, they had been traveling for 20 minutes into what they thought was open space toward a vulnerable capital world. They, in fact, had been traveling into a closing trap. The Dominion fleet came from 3 angles simultaneously. Not the slow, formal engagement lines that characterized Varek military doctrine for generations, the kind of engagement that looked impressive and gave the enemy time to read and respond. These ships moved in the staggered, fast, overlapping waves that Rail called pressure from every clock position. There was no single point of force to counter. There was only the constant erosion of capacity from every direction at once. The Shirasi formations, designed to concentrate firepower and break through in a single overwhelming surge, had no doctrine for this. Their commanders issued counter-orders that conflicted with each other because each order was responding to a different pressure vector, and there was no version of their strategy that addressed pressure from all of them simultaneously. Princess Avon commanded the Central Fleet Division from the bridge of a rebuilt warship that bore the scars of Keth Hollow still welded into its hull, a choice she had made deliberately. She wanted her crew to see the ship that survived. She wanted them to know what survival looked like. She was not the ceremonial princess who had left 3 years ago. She was something else now. Someone forged in debris fields and dead cities and 36-hour watches over a wounded human who refused to die. She was good at this in a way that her earlier self would not have recognized. Rail stood at the tactical station beside her, watching the battle unfold on the display with the quiet focus of someone reading something he had already half written. He did not command, he did not direct, He watched, and when the pattern shifted in ways that matched what he had anticipated, he said so, and Avon translated that into orders, and the fleet moved. It was not a partnership of one person leading and another following. It was the kind of coordination that only forms after months of surviving together, where the line between one person's thinking and another's begins to blur because trust has made the translation instantaneous. "Their rear column is going to turn," Rail said. Avon was already looking at it on the display. 40 seconds, she said. 35. Voskron's ready? His ships have been in position for 2 hours. 31 seconds later, the Shirasi rear column began to turn. Voskran's division was already there. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. When it ended, the Shirasi rear column had lost 40% of its strength and was retreating in a pattern that would take it directly across the edge of the debris field that Dominion engineers had seeded with sensor-invisible mines 48 hours earlier.
On the Empress's command bridge, Solvara watched the battle map update in real time. She had fought wars. She had watched commanders execute strategies under pressure for 30 years. She knew the difference between a plan working because it was good and a plan working because the person who designed it understood something true about how conflict actually moved. She watched the Shirasi forces dissolve, not broken by brute force, not overwhelmed by numbers, but systematically dismantled by a strategy that had accounted for their responses before they made them. It was, she thought, the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen on a command display. It was also, she admitted privately, terrifying, not because of what it was doing to the Shirasi, because she was now fully aware of what it meant that humanity had produced a mind like this. And if one stranded lieutenant with salvage tools and survival instinct could do what Rael Donner had done, what did that say about what humanity might be building in the parts of the galaxy the Dominion had never bothered to look at? The battle ended 6 hours after it began. The Shirasi Compact's assault force was broken across 3 engagement zones. Their communications were a disaster. Their command structure had fragmented when the expected defensive patterns failed to appear, and the counterorders stopped making sense. 14 of their largest warships had been destroyed. 32 more had taken damage serious enough to remove them from combat capability. The remainder were retreating. And on the royal docking platform of Varek Prime, where 3 years ago the Empire had waited in grief for news from Keth Hollow, bells rang. They rang because the Empire had won, but they also rang because something had changed in the winning that could not be unchanged. The Varek Dominion had won a war using a strategy designed by a human. That fact would travel faster than any fleet. 3 days after the battle, Empress Solvara called the full court to assembly. This was unusual. Full court assembly was reserved for coronations, declarations of war, and the pronouncements that changed the architecture of the empire. Every noble family sent representatives. Every general stood in their formal position. The chamber was filled to its maximum capacity for the first time in decades, and the air had the particular density of a room holding its breath. Avon stood before the throne in armor that had been properly repaired for the first time since she returned. It fit differently than it had before, not looser, but as though the person inside it had changed shape in ways that couldn't be measured in centimeters. Rael stood to her left in a simple dark uniform that one of the palace tailors had constructed at Avon's request. It bore no insignia of the Dominion and no insignia of Earth. It was simply clothing made for a man who had earned the right to stand where he stood. The general opposition had not disappeared. It had merely gone quieter, as opposition does when it is losing the argument. There were nobles in that chamber who believed that what the Empress was about to do would damage the Dominion's standing among the other civilizations of the sector. There were generals who believed it set a precedent that would weaken the idea of Varek exceptionalism, the long-standing doctrine that the Dominion's strength came from the purity of its traditions. Those generals had watched a human restructure their entire battle doctrine in 3 weeks and win them a war they had been quietly terrified of losing. Their argument had a significant credibility problem. Solvara rose from the obsidian throne. The chamber went absolutely silent. She walked down the steps of the dais, slowly, without ceremony, without the formal pronouncement that traditionally preceded descent. She simply walked, like a mother crossing a garden to reach her daughter, like an empress walking toward a decision she had already made in a garden 3 years ago, even before she knew what the decision would be. She stopped before them. She looked at Avon. She looked at Rael. She said quietly but clearly, "Tell me why." It was not a demand for justification. It was the kind of question that means, I want to hear you say it. I want the court to hear you say it. Give me the words. Rael took a moment. He looked at the Empress steadily. Because when I found her, I was 11 months alone and running out of reasons to keep going, and then there was someone else beside me, and that changed what was possible. He paused. That's all it was at first. But she treated me like a person from the first moment she was conscious enough to speak. Not a curiosity, not a lesser thing, not a tool, a person. I don't have a complicated reason for what I did after that. She was worth it. It was that simple. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned to her daughter.
Avon said nothing. She simply met her mother's eyes, and the Empress saw something she recognized. Not the girl who had left 3 years ago. Not even the princess who had come home scarred from the stars. She saw a ruler. Someone who had survived the kind of thing that either breaks a person or builds them into something harder and clearer and more true. Solvara raised her voice. It filled the chamber without effort, the voice of a woman who had been using rooms like this as instruments for 4 decades. The Varek Dominion was founded on the belief that strength is absolute, she said, that it is inherited, that it is ours by right of history and biology and the traditions of our ancestors. I believed this. I governed by it. And then my daughter came home from the dead, brought back by a being from a species we had classified as minor and unremarkable and of marginal concern. Not a sound in the chamber. Even the air seemed to stop. I watched that being stand in my war council and see through 3 years of strategic failure in a single evening. I watched him design a campaign that our generals had not been able to produce in a decade of preparation. I watched him do it calmly, methodically, without arrogance, and I understood something that I should have understood long before. She looked at Rael directly. Strength is not what we assumed, and humanity is not what we assumed. And when history asked what the Varek Dominion did when it discovered it had been wrong about something important, the answer will be that it changed. She reached into the folds of her robe and produced a seal. It was the Empress's personal seal, bearing the twin moons of the Varek bloodline. She held it toward Rael. "You hold no rank in my empire," she said. "You hold no title. You cannot be given one easily, and I will not insult what you are by pretending you need one from me to have worth." She paused. "But I can offer you something else, a formal recognition, a declaration that within the Varek Dominion your name is known, your service is honored, and your standing is not that of a stranger or a curiosity or a tool. You are named Companion of the Crown. It is a distinction that has been given twice in the Empire's history, both times to those who saved the royal line when no one else could." She extended the seal. Rael looked at it. Then he looked at Avon, who gave him nothing except the slight steadiness in her eyes that meant, "This is real, this is yours." He took the seal. The chamber did not erupt, it did not cheer. The sound that moved through it was something different, a long collective exhale, as though hundreds of people had been holding tension in their chests and had finally released it into something they hadn't expected to feel. Acceptance, slow and complicated, and not without doubt, but acceptance. General Voskron was the first to bow his head, just a fraction, just enough. The gesture moved through the room the way fire moves through connected material, from one figure to the next, until even the most resistant noble had made some small acknowledgement that the world had changed and they were still in it. Avon touched Rael's arm briefly, the same gesture she had made on the landing platform, simple and certain. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. That night, Empress Solvara stood at the balcony of her private chamber and looked out at the sky of Varek Prime. The orbital debris from the battle had largely cleared. The stars were visible again, sharp and cold and numberless, stretching in every direction across the dark. She thought about her daughter, sleeping in the palace for the first time in 3 years, in rooms that had waited for her, like something loyal and patient and quietly afraid of being given up on. She thought about Rael Donner, about what it meant that a stranded human being with salvage tools and survival training had looked at one of the greatest tactical challenges in the sector and seen the answer while her generals were still arguing about the problem. She thought about what that said not just about him specifically, but about his species, about what must be developing in the parts of the galaxy her empire had dismissed. She thought about the Shirasi compact, scattered and broken, and already, she suspected, trying to understand how they had lost. She wondered what stories they are telling themselves. She hoped, for practical reasons, that those stories were the wrong ones, that they were crediting her daughter's return, or her own political recovery, or some other explanation that did not require them to reconsider humanity. Because if they did reconsider humanity, they would arrive at the same place Solvara had arrived, and then the strategic picture of the entire sector would shift.